In the Pacific Northwest, tragedy would forever bind three women who would never meet. One disappeared just months before her wedding. Another vanished, leaving two children behind. A third survived her night of terror and spoke for the others she never knew. The hunt for a serial killer led FBI agents cross-country as they followed his deadly trail.
The disappearance of young women triggered a search that spanned the Pacific Northwest. Even a massive media campaign failed to locate the drifter who first charmed, then killed them. As investigators followed his trail, he always stayed one step ahead. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. In a case that landed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, agents hoped that the one victim the killer spared would help put him behind bars.
March 28th, 1987. LaRon Crouston left a party in the suburbs of Tacoma, Washington at 4 in the morning. He was looking forward to a day of fishing.
Come with me.
LaRon's fiancée, 22-year-old Robin Smith, decided to stay. She was having a good time. Robin assured LaRon she'd be fine.
I love you. I love you too.
She would just get a ride home from someone she'd met at the party. After fishing all day Saturday, LaRon fell asleep, exhausted. He didn't wake up until early Sunday afternoon.
Robin!
He hadn't seen his fiancée, Robin, since the party 2 days earlier.
Robin!
Concerned, the young man called Robin's mother.
Hello?
Yeah.
Edna Smith had assumed her daughter was with LaRon.
No, let me check. Just a minute. Robin?
She checked to see if Robin was in her old bedroom.
Robin? No, I haven't seen her.
Perhaps she'd come in late without being heard. LaRon told Edna not to worry.
Okay, I'll be there in a few
Maybe
minutes.
Robin
right?
had decided to spend the rest of the weekend at their friend's house.
Hello?
About an hour later, LaRon and Robin's brother arrived at the apartment.
No one there. Well, I don't guess we have any choice.
With no sign of Robin, her family decided to call police. LaRon joined the Smiths at their house to wait for detectives from the Pierce County Sheriff's Office. They were all worried. Robin had never done anything like this before. They described Robin as a happy young woman, though quiet. She worked long hours as a waitress, saving most of her money to help pay for her upcoming wedding. Detective Terry Wilson and his partner initiated an investigation.
Per information we received from her mother, Miss Smith, it was unlike Robin to have just walked up and taken off. She was engaged to get married. She was close to her family. And every time she ever went any place her family was, she usually told them where she was going to be at. And so this was unlike her.
LaRon Crouston told detectives about the last night he'd seen Robin. Early in the morning of March 28th, Robin and LaRon hung out at a bar until it closed at 2 a.m. Some people they had met during the evening invited them to an after-hours party at their nearby apartment. The place was rented by Elizabeth Glynn and Darren D. O'Neill. LaRon and Robin were having such a good time they didn't want it to end. The last place LaRon had seen Robin was at the party.
Before you got to the dinner, what time did you go?
Detective Wilson went to the duplex where the party had been held. He found Elizabeth Glynn at home. She corroborated LaRon's story and told the detective that she had intended to drive Robin home.
How long did you leave?
But as the night wore on, her plans changed. Darren seemed more interested in Robin, so Elizabeth remained in the kitchen and flirted with a man named Mike Prahota. Elizabeth told the detective that she and Prahota had made plans to meet later at his apartment, where they could be alone. Prahota left the party first to avoid arousing Darren's suspicions. By daybreak, Darren D. O'Neill hardly seemed to notice. He was wrapped up telling Robin about his favorite author, Louis L'Amour, who wrote stories about the Wild West. O'Neill was unemployed and talked about living off the land like the outdoorsman in L'Amour's books. Elizabeth had heard it all before. At about 8 a.m., she left the apartment to meet Prahota. She told O'Neill and Robin she was going out to buy more beer. When she returned 24 hours later, O'Neill and Robin were gone. Elizabeth pointed out that she found several items missing from the apartment.
In searching the apartment, we found that there was a television that had been pulled out and the television electrical cord had been removed. There was a couple of lamps from his girlfriend had told us that had extension cords on it. These were missing. A lot of his clothes were gone, and she specifically mentioned that there was a blanket that also was missing from the house.
Is this yours?
In a file box, Wilson also found Social Security cards with several different aliases. They included the unusual name of Zebulon McCranahan. When Detective Wilson told his partner what he'd learned, Detective Walt Stout immediately suspected foul play.
Robin was left alone with Darren O'Neill, and something happened at that residence after that. It would be speculation that maybe Darren tried to come on to her physically or sexually. She may have rejected that, or there was something that happened there, and I believe she was probably assaulted in that house.
Detective's next question, Dennis Morrison, O'Neill's friend and former employer. Morrison said O'Neill had worked for him as a carpenter.
When's the last time you saw him?
It was last night. He asked me for a loan.
He said he had seen O'Neill just a few days earlier. It was Saturday afternoon, the day after the all-night party.
Running kind of low on cash, man. You ain't got about 30 bucks I can get from you, dude.
O'Neill stopped by to ask for traveling money.
I had no cash on me at all.
He said he was heading east over the Cascade Mountains. Morrison had no cash to give him. O'Neill was about to leave when Morrison realized he could write him a check. He went to O'Neill's car to make the offer. His friend seemed nervous and anxious to leave. Then a movement in the back of the car caught Morrison's eye. It looked like something was pushing against the back seat from inside the trunk. O'Neill told him it was his dog. He put it there to punish it. Before Morrison could say another word, O'Neill pulled away.
That's all he said.
Haven't heard from him since.
Morrison described the car as a tan Chrysler with Montana tags.
It was the day after the party.
Thank you.
Authorities knew they were 3 days behind O'Neill. By now, he could be anywhere. Detectives continued to pursue the handful of O'Neill's known contacts in the area. They called Gary Skinner, the owner of another cabinet shop where O'Neill had worked part-time. He told detectives he'd been looking for Darren O'Neill since his last day at work.
When Darren left, he apparently took a hammer with him from the shop because it was missing, and Mr. Skinner couldn't account for it having been taken in any other way.
With no leads pointing to his whereabouts, Pierce County detectives hoped O'Neill's past would provide some answers. A background check revealed that the suspect was no stranger to trouble.
He had warrants out for him. He had been in trouble in Colorado. He had been accused of sexual assault, physical assault. All of his victims that we were aware of had been females. So a profile of him was starting to form that we was looking for a person who is possibly predatory in nature, but violent for sure.
Pierce County deputies entered everything they knew about Darren D. O'Neill into the National Crime Information Database, the NCIC, a listing of criminals and victims nationwide. They included his physical characteristics, a description of his tattoos, and the make and model of his car. If O'Neill were picked up by any police department in the country, Pierce County would be notified immediately. Detectives also helped Robin's family launch a media campaign to locate the missing woman. Robin's picture was posted all over the Tacoma, Washington area, along with O'Neill's. The campaign began to generate leads. O'Neill was spotted entering a local hospital alone on March 29th.
There was no security at the hospital, but the ER nurses were nervous at this man's presence. So they did call a couple of male employees of the hospital, and Darren ultimately left without receiving any treatment for some scratches that were visible.
Investigators believed Robin had inflicted the scratches on O'Neill's face when he attacked her. The hospital staff told police that the scruffy man bore a teardrop tattoo at the corner of one eye. The letters J-U-N-E were tattooed across the knuckles of one hand. Detectives learned that June was the name of O'Neill's ex-wife. The media campaign continued to generate leads. A highway flagman had seen O'Neill in his car at 2 different locations on March 30th, 2 days after Robin's disappearance. The first sighting was on a highway construction site east of Tacoma.
Construction, just keep it slow.
O'Neill was heading south when the flagman waved him through.
Keep it slow, sir.
He also saw O'Neill a few hours later at a gas station off the same highway.
Hang on a second. I want you to take a look at some pictures.
He called police when he recognized the man's face from the newspaper. To be sure, the detective showed the flagman a photo lineup.
Take a look at 6 photo here. See if
It included a mugshot of O'Neill alongside 5 others. The flagman picked out O'Neill immediately. As investigators continued the hunt, a Washington state trooper spotted a tan Chrysler with Montana tags on the afternoon of March 30th. The same day the flagman had seen O'Neill. It had been abandoned on the side of Interstate 5, about 50 miles north of Pierce County, 2 days after Robin's disappearance. Unaware of the ongoing investigation, the officer found nothing suspicious about the car. He followed proper procedure by calling in the license plate and vehicle description. A communications officer entered the tag number into a database. The information should have triggered the NCIC listing on O'Neill and his vehicle. It did not. She had mistakenly typed the abbreviation MO for the state of Missouri instead of MT for Montana. The trooper on Highway 5 was still unaware that this was the very car Darren D. O'Neill had been driving following Robin Smith's disappearance. Investigators' best clue was about to be towed to the impound lot. On March 30th, 1987, a Washington state trooper found a tan Chrysler with Montana tags 50 miles east of Tacoma. Misinformed by his communications officer, the trooper was unaware that Darren D. O'Neill, the man wanted in connection with the disappearance of Robin Smith, had abandoned the car. The vehicle was towed to an impound lot for future sale. A few days later, the local paper ran an article about Robin Smith's abduction. The story described O'Neill's car. It sounded similar to a Chrysler the tow truck operator had recently impounded. He checked the make, model, and license plate. They matched. He quickly notified police. Detectives ran a check of the Chrysler's vehicle ID number. A man calling himself Zebulon McCranahan was reported to have stolen it from an Idaho residence in 1986. Wilson immediately remembered the peculiar name from an ID card he'd found at O'Neill's home. It was one of the suspect's aliases. At the Pierce County West Precinct garage, detectives and evidence technicians processed the Chrysler. They hoped to find some trace evidence linking O'Neill or Robin to the car. While technicians searched the interior, the detectives moved to the trunk. They found a large quantity of dried blood. Detectives also found a blood-stained lavender jacket. Mrs. Smith later identified the garment as Robin's. They also recovered teeth, bone chips, and a clump of hair. O'Neill's fingerprints on empty beer cans pointed to his involvement. If Detective Wilson had held out some slim hope that Robin was still alive, it was now gone.
We felt now that we probably had a homicide on our hands by the way the type of blood that was found in the trunk and the amount of the blood that was found. And so we started focusing on Darren as a homicide suspect. And at this point in time, the whole tone of the investigation started changing.
But to charge O'Neill with murder, examiners at the Washington State Forensics Lab first needed to confirm that the hair and bone fragments belonged to Robin Smith. Pierce County sheriffs requested Robin's dental records and blood type sent to the lab. But there was a problem. Robin had not been to the dentist since childhood. She also had never documented her blood type. Since a definitive match with known samples could not be made, murder charges could not be filed. As the hunt for suspected killer Darren D. O'Neill ground to an abrupt halt, 120 miles to the north, Detective Carlotta Jarrett of the Bellingham, Washington Police Department was working on a similar case. Wendy Aughey, a 28-year-old single mother, was reported missing when she failed to pick up her daughter. Wendy had a date the evening of April 24th, 1987. She left her daughter with the child's grandmother. When Wendy failed to return or call, the grandmother drove over to her house to find the little girl's favorite pillow. On Wendy's bed, she found bloodstains and called the police. Detective Jarrett obtained a warrant to search the house. Wendy's car, a red Ford Torino, was missing. The front door to Wendy's house had been left unlocked. Her wallet and keys were missing. In the bedroom, Detective Jarrett found evidence of a brutal attack.
There was bodily fluids in the bed, and there was a great amount of pooled blood underneath that pillow, which had seeped to the mattress below. There was low to medium impact velocity blood spatters on a wall, and there were also blood smears on the wall.
Bellingham police retrieved the entire bed as evidence. On the headboard, they found more of Wendy's blood, along with 2 blonde hairs that did not belong to the missing woman. Police also recovered an acrylic fingernail. Wendy's friends told police that she had worn acrylic nails on her date with a man named Michael Johnson. Wendy had met Johnson earlier that afternoon on her lunch break. He was the new bartender at La Paloma restaurant. Detective Jarrett checked the restaurant for leads.
I contacted the owner to see if she'd filled out an employment application for Mr. Johnson, and the only thing she had was a placemat that he had written some information on. She gave that placemat to me, and we did process it for fingerprints.
While the detective waited for results, she visited a local mission which the bartender had listed on the placemat as his residence. Detective Jarrett spoke to the desk clerk at the mission, who remembered the day Johnson checked out.
He had seen Mr. Johnson at the mission at 7:30 in the morning on the day after that Wendy had a date with him. And at that time, he was wearing black slacks, a vest, a white shirt and a tie, and told him he was going to work. He also said he had met a lady and he was going to move in with her. This person also said that Mr. Johnson was driving a red Torino and drove away in it. Previous to this point, he'd had no vehicle.
On May 4th, 1987, Jarrett received a phone call from police in Eugene, Oregon. They had found Wendy's car, a red Ford Torino, abandoned in the parking lot of a tavern. Inside, police recovered fingerprints that matched the fingerprints found on the placemat. A check through the automated fingerprint identification system revealed that the prints belonged to Darren D. O'Neill, the man wanted for the suspected murder of Robin Smith. Detective Jarrett contacted authorities in Pierce County, 120 miles south of Bellingham. They quickly realized there were striking similarities in both cases.
Since we were convinced that Darren O'Neill was responsible for Robin Smith's death, and we also felt that he was responsible for Wendy Ahi's disappearance and possible death, we felt that the rest of the people in the country were also at great risk from Darren O'Neill.
Pierce County deputies called in the FBI to assist in the hunt. Former Special Agent Del Oros of the FBI's Tacoma Resident Agency was assigned the case.
At that point, we knew we were dealing with an individual who was extremely mobile and extremely dangerous. He had the history of a violent sexual predator, and now he had the current tag or label of a murderer.
Since Wendy and Robin's bodies were still missing, formal murder charges were not filed. Sexual assault charges against O'Neill were still pending in Colorado. The FBI opened a federal case against the fugitive for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Still, O'Neill managed to stay one step ahead. No one knew where the suspected serial killer fled after he left Oregon. And authorities still had no murder case unless they found the bodies of the missing women. In May 1987, evidence pointed to the brutal slaying of 2 innocent women in Washington state. The FBI and local police launched a media campaign to flush out suspected killer Darren D. O'Neill. Dozens of agents fanned out to investigate sightings all over the Pacific Northwest.
Yes.
O'Neill was spotted hitchhiking at truck stops north and south of Seattle. One trucker gave O'Neill a ride on May 23rd. He claimed his passenger thanked him for the ride because the cops were after him. The trucker pulled off the highway a short time later and left O'Neill just a few miles outside the city. Special Agent Del Oros recalled that even as leads came in, the hunt for the elusive killer did not get any easier.
The months immediately following the disappearance of Robin Smith and Wendy Ahi were extremely frustrating. Because of O'Neill's change in facial appearance, a change in weight, people were consistently telling us that the pictures that we were showing of O'Neill were actually 2 different people. Well, they weren't.
The FBI focused on places the drifter might blend in. Because O'Neill was constantly on the move, agents questioned travelers at local bus and train stations. They hoped someone had spotted O'Neill and would remember his distinctive tattoos. Even when they found people who had seen the fugitive, it was always too late. O'Neill was comfortable in the ever-changing world of transients and drifters, where people could easily disappear forever.
It wasn't as though we were going to find Darren O'Neill at the local Ramada Inn. It forced us to take a hard look at the reality of having to search for him in places where he would blend in very, very easily. By way of example, we looked in bus stops, homeless shelters, day labor camps. He was certainly not anyone who was going to be holding a 9-to-5 job, which really did increase the difficulty in trying to find him as the pursuit went on through the subsequent months.
While agents and detectives continued to pursue hundreds of mostly false sightings, detectives were called to the rural area surrounding Crystal Mountain, just east of Washington State's Mount Rainier. Hikers had reported finding what appeared to be human remains. The location was close to where a flagman had seen O'Neill's car about a month earlier, not long after Robin Smith's disappearance. Just inside the woodline, officers spotted a jawbone and a skull. Each item was carefully flagged before it was retrieved. As Stout and Wilson surveyed the crime scene, they wondered whether the remains were Robin's. Investigators also found other bones scattered in the vicinity. Folded clothing was found, hidden in the base of a nearby tree. It matched the description of the outfit Robin had worn to the party. They also recovered a wallet. Inside, they found Robin Smith's driver's license. Investigators fanned out to cover a wide area. Their persistence paid off. They found a claw hammer with markings similar to the one reported missing by one of O'Neill's former employers. Detectives also suspected it was the murder weapon. The Pierce County medical examiner agreed. A careful examination of the remains revealed that Robin had probably died as the result of blunt force trauma to the head. Darren D. O'Neill was charged with first-degree murder.
Once the remains of Robin Smith were found, we certainly had the confirmation that a murder had occurred. And by virtue of that murder, the Washington federal authorities then issued their own separate and second investigation. They issued another unlawful flight to avoid prosecution warrant for him.
The FBI was more determined than ever to get their hands on the man responsible for this heinous crime. By June of 1987, the FBI had issued 2 federal warrants for the arrest of suspected serial killer Darren D. O'Neill, still on the loose in the Pacific Northwest. The remains of one woman had been recovered close to Mount Rainier. The second woman was still missing and presumed dead. Since O'Neill was last known to be in Eugene, Oregon, Special Agent Michael Elsey of the FBI's Portland field office was called in.
Knowing that he was a sexual predator, I went and checked with the local police agencies with some of their sexual assault cases to see if his MO fit any of, or description or anything fit any of their pending cases.
Special Agent O'Donnell, Detective Smith.
It meant hundreds of man-hours, but agents refused to simply wait for another sighting or another victim. Dozens of agents met with detectives in districts across the region to try to link O'Neill to outstanding sexual assault cases. The search was complicated by the fact that O'Neill looked very different in each of his mugshots. Most often, the agents left empty-handed. Frustrated and out of leads, agents continued to wade through hundreds of old case files. With a dangerous predator on the prowl, agents had to exhaust every possibility. An agent met with police detective Bill Carter in Portland. As he had done a dozen times before, the agent compared O'Neill's picture to sketches of sexual predators. One sketch stood out. It bore a strong resemblance to the fugitive. A 14-year-old girl named Heidi Lang had provided the drawing 5 months earlier when she filed rape charges against her unknown attacker. From the police report, her description of the crime sounded eerily similar to O'Neill's other assaults.
From looking at the photos of Mr. O'Neill, especially when he had a beard and the glasses, I saw that there was quite a bit of resemblance between the two, and the method and MO were similar as well. Luckily, he did not kill Miss Lang, as he had other subjects.
Agent Elsey wanted to speak with Heidi Lang as soon as possible. Detective Carter arranged a meeting between the young girl and the FBI. With her mother by her side, she told the story from the beginning. At around midnight on January 17, 1987, 2 months before Robin Smith disappeared, Heidi broke her mother's curfew and walked to the nearby convenience store to get a soda. It was a tough part of town. The young girl had walked it many times before, but never this late at night. As she crossed an overpass leading to the store, a trucker called to her from his parked rig. She ignored him and walked on. It only took her a few minutes to get the soda. Then she started back home. She walked as quickly as she could to get back before her mother knew she had left. Heidi told investigators that as she approached the overpass, the man and the truck were gone. But on the other side of the overpass, the trucker jumped out of the bushes and grabbed her.
Get in the truck! Get in the truck! Get in!
He forced her down an embankment at knife point and shoved her into his semi parked at the side of the highway. Years later, Heidi recalls that she believed her young life was over.
The first thing I noticed is how dangerous he was. I felt that he had every intention of killing me. There was no question in my mind.
Get in the back!
He threw her into the sleeper compartment of his truck. She was terrified, with no idea where he might take her or what he might do.
He threatened to make me a whore, sell me to pimps. He was gonna cut me open if I tried finding what was going to keep from angering this man. I had to behave like I was just holding conversation with him, and at the same time learn what I could about him.
Despite Heidi's best efforts, the trucker climbed into the sleeper compartment and repeatedly raped the 14-year-old for 4 hours.
And he did not like to think of you as a woman. That brought him to violence. I had to keep him talking, mostly to keep his mind off other things. And I tried my best to give him the impression that I was insignificant. And I was just there to be there with him. And it wouldn't mean anything if he let me go.
Heidi's insight and courage paid off. After suffering hours of abuse, her tormentor let her go. She ran until she reached a truck stop. She asked an employee for a ride home. After all she'd been through, Heidi bravely submitted to a rape test. This provided investigators with samples of the rapist's semen, though no match could be made until the suspect was in custody.
Identify the man. Take a look at these, please.
When Heidi finished her story, Detective Carter showed her a number of photos of O'Neill and some similar-looking men.
It was amazing that he was in it, and I did see him, and I picked him out. I really did not expect to see him in them. I hadn't really heard anything since I had given the sketch.
Seeing her attacker's face brought the memories flooding back, but she never hesitated to press charges. Heidi was determined to face her rapist and put him behind bars.
I think that she wanted to see that this person did not do that to anyone else ever again. And so it showed very much strength in her character, and especially at the age of 14, being able to be so descriptive in the events that occurred, the description of the subject and him, that kind of got us to the path where we were.
Agent Elsie called the Tacoma office. They finally had a witness to testify against O'Neill.
He had run other places,
but they still had to find him. Agent Del Oros called FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. to request additional assistance. On June 18, 1987, Darren D. O'Neill's name was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. The case was now a priority for every FBI office in the country. Agents had to find O'Neill before he could strike again. In June of 1987, suspected serial killer Darren D. O'Neill was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Special Agent Del Oros was in charge of the case. He convinced the FBI's Fugitive Publicity Unit in Washington, D.C. that Darren D. O'Neill fit the list's criteria.
The Bureau's determination as to who goes on to the top 10 wanted list is a function of a lot of different factors. Primarily, it's the protection of the community. Secondarily, it has to do with the ability of those individuals to be mobile, to transport themselves across interstate lines, so effectively going from state to state.
With nationwide publicity, the manhunt for O'Neill was relentless. Countless sightings were reported in several states. O'Neill was most often spotted in bars and taverns in the Northwest.
Looking for a guy who may have been seen around here.
Investigators followed up on dozens of leads, only to find witnesses with vague descriptions of the fugitive. Nobody knew of his whereabouts.
Anything noticeable about his appearance?
Agents were left with little to go on.
Okay, thank you very much.
So we had a long stretch of time when the clues were drying up. The leads from other agents were not producing any form of immediate return. We were going back and to the same people, consistently re-interviewing the family, friends. We were reaching out as far as going to prior instructors, prior employers, looking for some type of clue that would tell us or show us a pattern of his activity and his mobility across the country.
7 months later, on February 3rd, 1988, agents discovered that O'Neill had made his way to Lakeland, Florida. He was spotted by a Lakeland police officer conducting what appeared to be a drug deal.
Got some good stuff. You got the money?
The officer was unaware that O'Neill was wanted for murder. O'Neill noticed the cop but did nothing. The officer turned his car around to investigate. When the cruiser pulled past the stopped car, O'Neill pulled up and asked for directions, pretending he was lost. The officer asked him to pull over. Instead, O'Neill took off. The officer followed, calling in the Louisiana tags on O'Neill's car as he drove. O'Neill tried to lose him, zigzagging through the streets of Lakeland. When their car jumped a curb, the suspects ran.
On foot, chasing a white male.
The officer pursued on foot and eventually caught them all.
Your car, where you at in your car?
O'Neill was extradited to Louisiana when police learned the car he'd been driving was reported stolen from that state. When asked, O'Neill told police his name was Jean Mailloux.
A clerk who was working nights compared the fingerprints of the individual that she knew as Jean Mailloux to the list of fingerprints associated with FBI top 10 wanted fugitives and found that the individual that she knew as Jean Mailloux was the individual that we knew as Darren O'Neill.
O'Neill was extradited to Washington State to face charges. But state prosecutors knew their cases were weak. Since Wendy Aughey's body was never recovered, O'Neill could not be charged with her murder. The Robin Smith case was stronger, but lacked definitive forensic identification. It would be difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the body found in the woods was Robin Smith's.
Okay, let's go back to that.
Despite the evidentiary obstacles, prosecutors moved ahead with the Robin Smith case.
In 1987, you remember...
They would take their chances with a jury. O'Neill and his attorney would never let the case get that far. In a Pierce County court on January 4th, 1989, O'Neill pled guilty to first-degree murder in the killing of Robin Smith. Detective Wilson knew there was an ulterior motive behind the plea.
The court system in the state of Washington at that time was, if a person was convicted of first-degree murder, but there was a loophole in there. If you pled guilty to the charge, the maximum time you got was 333 months.
The family of Robin Smith was devastated. Even without parole, O'Neill would be free well before the end of his natural life. The killers still face charges in Portland, Oregon for the kidnapping and rape of 14-year-old Heidi Lang. If convicted, O'Neill would be put away for life. But prosecutors had a problem. Deputy District Attorney Charles Sparks recalls that the rape kit Heidi had provided at the time of her assault would not be admissible for a comparison with O'Neill.
There was a sexual assault kit that included vaginal swabs that were taken, and that had molded because of the way these things were stored back then, and it was not usable. And DNA evidence would have been very helpful, but we just didn't have it.
On May 16, 1990, as O'Neill's trial began, prosecutors knew their only chance was to put Heidi on the witness stand to face her attacker. It would be traumatic for her, but it was their best hope for putting O'Neill behind bars for good.
So it was very difficult for me to testify at the trial. It was even more difficult to look at him face to face. It was very frightening, very scary experience. First of all, at this point, I had promised this man that I wouldn't tell anybody what happened. And this is a man who had no qualms about going after anybody, even just a girl walking down the street in the middle of the night. I knew I had to put him away, or I was as good as dead. That's the way I view it.
From here today, could you point to that man?
Heidi pointed out the man who had kidnapped and raped her, sitting sullenly just a few yards in front of her. Her testimony was enough to convict O'Neill. The jury found him guilty on all 16 counts of kidnapping and rape. Under Oregon law, he was sentenced to 135 years in prison. Darren D. O'Neill is serving his first sentence of 27 years at a Washington State penitentiary. He will then be transferred to Oregon to spend the rest of his life behind bars.
Once he was convicted, I was able to put a lot of this in the past. I was able to put it away. And that was most important to me. That's the most, I don't think I would have ever gotten over this if we hadn't put him away.
For Agent Oros, though he has since left the FBI to serve as Deputy District Attorney in Sacramento, California, the case remains fresh in his mind.
Well, to this very day, I still have the wanted flyer for Darren O'Neill hanging in my office here at the District Attorney's office. He, even on the wall, is a constant reminder of the dangers that face each and every one of us as we go out on the street. I'm particularly aware of the fact that he represents a significant danger to women in society. He's an individual that was a cold, calculated murder, and he reaffirms for me that I'm in a profession that matters, and that every day when I go into court, I'm there to make a difference.